Mary Shelley was born in London in 1797 as the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Machines were being introduced into nearly every facet of life, improving output and efficiency, and giving way to the new factory system where large mechanical objects ruled. Practically overnight, the social, economic, and political mores of old were upended by processes, tools, and new ways of generating power. And in the middle of this societal upheaval, young Shelley was born. Her father, a philosopher and active member of the freethinker movement, educated Shelley and offered her access to his extensive library. He believed strongly in the use of scientific inquiry and logic to form opinions, regardless of established belief. By age 17, she met and fell in love with aristocrat Percy Shelley, who was ostracized from his family for his own radical beliefs, like wanting to donate large swaths of his family's money to the disadvantaged. By 19, she had borne him 2 children out of wedlock, earning her ostracism from her own family and social circle. Then, at 20, she introduced the world to Frankenstein, a story about a pale, borderline mad student and scientist who gives life to an unholy, read unnatural, creature conceived in an unorthodox scientific experiment. Just as it was for Victor and his creature, Mary's relationship with parenthood was complicated. Her mother, the famous Mary Wollstonecraft, died of puerperal fever right after giving birth, and 3 of Shelley's own children died before reaching adulthood. In the process of making his own offspring, Frankenstein eventually kills everything he loves. The risks of creation, Mary Shelley reminds us, are high. The idea for Frankenstein came to Shelley while on vacation in Switzerland in the summer of 1816 with her then lover and future husband Percy Shelley. They were joined by poet Lord Byron, Byron's physician John Polidori, and her half-sister Claire Clairmont. The weather that year was strange, borderline terrifying. The explosion of Indonesia's Mount Tambora in 1815 cast gases and particulates into the atmosphere. In England, Europe, and the United States, 1816 became known as the year without a summer. It snowed in Virginia on July 4th. The killing frosts of that topsy-turvy summer brought famine and then disease to a lot of people. Gorgeous sunsets were small compensation. For many across the globe, it felt like the world was ending. The Shelleys and their friends spent most of their summer indoors, hiding from the rattling electrical storms and rain. They spoke of science and philosophy, or the men spoke. Mary, by her own account, mostly listened. At one point, after scaring the pants off each other with ghost stories, they decided to try to write their own. Much of the dark portentousness of that summer's weather made it into the bones of the Frankenstein story. That fall, she returned to England and began reading texts about alchemy, like family friend Humphrey Davy's Elements of Chemical Philosophy. And so, it's no surprise that Victor Frankenstein lived in a world where boundaries between science and magic were thin. Shelley borrowed from real inventions as well. At one point in the novel, Victor mentions witnessing experiments made with an air pump, a device first used a few decades earlier that allowed humans to create a vacuum in a laboratory and caused experimental science to jump forward exponentially. And it wasn't just the science that informed Shelley's writing, it was also the reaction to it. Philosopher Thomas Hobbes publicly argued with scientists about their new powers of experimentation, finding the idea that investigators could now create a controlled environment in a lab to be profoundly suspect, a hubristic violation of natural law. But Shelley's most direct influences were the ones that pondered where life came from. One scientist obsessed with this question was Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather. The older Darwin put wheat flour slurry in containers and let it sour. He observed what he called eels, microscopic worms, in the smelly goo. They could not possibly float in the atmosphere and pass through the sealed glass vial, he reasoned, so they must come into being by a spontaneous vital process. Louis Pasteur finally proved the concept of spontaneous generation wrong in 1859. But when Shelley was writing, people still believed, as they had since the age of Aristotle, that new life could come from nowhere. Another theory fashionable at the time, galvanism, ultimately provided a better way for Shelley to bring her creature to life. In the 1790s, Luigi Galvani, an Italian scientist, made the muscles in detached frogs' legs jump by connecting them with a charged metal rod. Galvani began to study something he called animal electricity, which he thought came from inside a body. In the early 19th century, Galvani's nephew, Giovanni Aldini, traveled around electrocuting human bodies for curious audiences. His show drew capacity crowds, and he carried out his experiments for such famous witnesses as the Prince of Wales. In London, at the Newgate Prison in 1803, Aldini connected a battery invented by his uncle's scientific rival, Alessandro Volta, to the body of George Forster, a man who had recently been executed for murder. An observer wrote of the effects. The jaw of the deceased criminal began to quiver. The adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye was actually opened. In the subsequent part of the process, the right hand was raised and clenched, and the legs and thighs were set in motion. It appeared to the uninformed part of the bystanders as if the wretched man was on the eve of being restored to life. At the time Shelley wrote Frankenstein, doctors and scientists like Aldini often experimented on the bodies of convicted criminals, the poor, and others who, like George Forster, lacked the social protections for a decent burial. Victor assembles his creature's body out of parts he scavenged from graveyards, charnel houses, and slaughterhouses, so this would have been a familiar horror to Shelley's readers. And while the core concept behind galvanism and the idea of spontaneous generation were soon to fade from scientific favor, the novel yielded other techniques doctors of the era used to give new life to the sick, like blood transfusion, pioneered by James Blundell in the early 19th century, or defibrillation, which uses electricity to regulate the beats of a human heart. So at the dawn of the modern era, where thinking people found themselves enveloped in a hazy combination of science and mysticism, Mary Shelley wrote a book that's been since called the first ever science fiction novel. A book that didn't simply report on the science of the time, but also asked, what does it all mean?